Hello and welcome to the Michael Collins House podcast. On this episode of our podcast, we have Cal McCarthy, our own resident historian from the Michael Collins House Museum, will be on to discuss Michael Collins' youth and his early life, the young fella we call it, and the most of the content of this is coming from research that has been carried out by Cal McCarthy for Michael Collins House over the course of the last number of years, in kind of providing a better understanding of Michael Collins' youth and his ancestors and where he came from, really. I suppose this is a fairly big undertaking of research that Cal has carried out, and really credit must be given to Cal on this. He is a fabulous historian and researcher, and puts it all together very well as well. So this is the basis of a paper which we published last year, and of another paper as well that was published in the Clonakilty Journal on Patrick O'Driscoll. So this is a culmination of both of them, which also form the basis of a new exhibit that we have in the Michael Collins House, which kind of details his youth along with some very interesting artifacts from his early years as well. So without further ado, here is The Young Fella, presented by our own Cal McCarthy. Enjoy.
To mark the anniversary of Collins's birth in Woodfield on the 16th of October 1890, we've decided to release a podcast which is based on some work done here in the museum on Collins's youth and childhood in the Clonakilty, Rosscarbery areas. There are some, I think, 74 books related to Michael Collins listed in the British Library's catalogue when I last checked about 12 months ago. They're not all biographies, but they are all dealing with some aspect of his career or with the careers of those who were closely associated with him. The biographies that are there, and there's probably, I would say, about maybe 20 kind of what you might typically define as biographies, they don't tend to look at the youth in extensive detail. So consequently, that's one of the gaps that we try to fill. We are, like all historians, I guess you try to, what they call, contribute to knowledge, meaning you don't just regurgitate information that others have researched and written. You try to provide new information and bring new information into the study of, whatever part of the discipline. The information that I'm about to outline is contained in an essay which is published on the Michael Collins website. It's also contained in another essay which was published in the Clonakilty Journal, the third Clonakilty Journal. That was specifically an essay dealing with Patrick O'Driscoll, whom we'll talk about in a minute. The great advantage, I guess, of publishing some of this on our website is that you can amend it as the years and months roll by. That basically our knowledge of Collins is always evolving due to my own research and the research of other people, who will bring new things to the table as well. And we simply try and reflect that in the museum. It's our own research is extremely important to us, but it has to obviously take in the full broadest range of knowledge that we possibly can. So in terms of Collins's youth, like I say, we can bring a little bit that you won't, hopefully quite a bit that you won't read in any of the biographies. The biographies tend to dwell on his political career and the latter third of his life rather than the first 2/3. The youth, insofar as they research it or as they outline it, comes primarily from Pierce Beasley's biography, which was published in 1926, having been researched by Beasley since not long after Collins's death in 1922. And much of what Beasley tells us about Collins's youth comes directly from Collins's siblings, and much of what subsequent biographers told us about his youth comes both from Beasley's account and from interviews with subsequent generations of the Collins family. So I guess what we have hopefully supplemented at those accounts with is a little bit of what the official record can tell us about Collins' youth. So, like we all know, he was born in Woodfield on the 16th of October 1890. Woodfield is just a few miles west of Clonakilty. It's actually in Rosscarbery parish. 80 acres. It was an 80-acre farm, which for its time was a big farm, mixed enterprise out there. They did, a little bit of animal rearing, a little bit of tillage, a little bit of everything really. Collins was, I suppose, primarily influenced, like most of us, by his parents and his siblings. His mother's family in particular are worth looking at, because Collins' mother's family were extraordinarily well educated for a family of the time. Her name was Mary Ann O'Brien. She came from just up the road in Sam's Cross, just across the fields really from the Collins homestead. She was some 40 years younger than the man that she married, so one would assume it was an arranged match. She was a farmer's daughter. He was operating at that time. Michael John Collins was living on the farm that was leased by his brother Paddy, and his brother Paddy and his brother Tommy worked the farm. And as I say, Paddy held the lease at that point. Michael Collins' father, Michael John Sr., seems to have been a tradesman of sorts, though also no doubt a farmer on what was his brother's enterprise. So Mary Ann married in there, but as I say, her own family were extraordinarily well educated people. She was born, in around the 1850s. She had a brother in the RIC, she had sisters teachers, she had sisters civil servants. So, for their time, she also had another brother actually who was a town councillor for a period in the town of Clonakilty. So for their time, very well educated people. And when she married into the Collins homestead, she probably brought that kind of value on education with her. She saw, and presumably Michael John Collins as well, saw the education as a way up in the world. So Collins' siblings were very well educated too. He had three sisters teachers. He had a sister, a nun, and he had a sister in the civil service. He also had a brother who emigrated to America and became a policeman over there, and he had a brother at home farming, his older brother Johnny. The kind of so when you're talking about Collins, you kind of have to keep that in mind, that the education was extremely important to him, and to his mother, I would say, and to his parents, and consequently later to him. Now, the biographies that we've spoken about will give you the kind of standard Republican nursery type story that Collins was born into this very Republican family, and he was almost destined to be a rebel always because of all the rebels that were around him. And when you look at kind of examine that for validity outside of the sources that I mentioned earlier on, you do find some probability in some of that, I think. For example, the father's family, it was often said that Michael Collins' father was a Fenian. Now, you don't find any official records of that. It's hardly surprising given that the Fenians were a secret organisation. But what you do find when you look is that about in 1865, I think, a few miles from the Collins homestead, there was a Michael Collins who was arrested for marching in formation. So this Michael Collins was most likely a Fenian. Now, was it Michael's father? I think possibly, though Michael's father would have been in his 40s, I think, at that stage. So it was probably more likely to have been a cousin of Michael's. And we do know that he had some cousins who were Fenians. When you look at the Fenian records from after the Fenian Rebellion, you find that one of those who was arrested under arms away up in Drogheda, County Louth, was a man called Maurice Collins. He gave his address as Woodfield, County Cork, which had to have been the farm that Michael Collins was subsequently reared on. So it's interesting as well that one of the cousins gave his address at that farm and not at any other farm. So it tells you kind of that the Collins family, I think, as I say, it was Paddy's farm, but perhaps those three bachelor farmers at that point, the three brothers Collins, possibly had a lot of their nephews in and out to them. That man also that was arrested in Drogheda had a brother called Michael, so that may well have been the Fenian that was arrested in proximity to the family home. So there is some evidence for sure of Fenian activity within the family, even though there is perhaps no direct evidence or no incontrovertible evidence anyway that Collins's father was a Fenian. One of the other family stories that was kind of, I guess, used to outline the family's associations with rebel activity was that two of his uncles were reportedly imprisoned for militia or for beating up a land agent who'd been trampling their crops. Now, frankly, when I first heard that, I kind of tended to put that down to us, more of this kind of romance that Collins was a rebel born in a family of rebels, and what other way could he have turned out but the way that he did turn out. So frankly, I didn't really believe it. But I went looking at the prison records for in and around the time that was claimed, and I found that in 1852 there was a Tommy and Paddy Collins who were imprisoned in Cork prison. They were imprisoned for malicious assault. So, and that was only, I think, 2 years after I think it was the Forrester biography of 1971 that mentioned this imprisonment, which was a family story at the time. So the family story, even though maybe it's a couple of years out or whatever, it absolutely has some validity. What's interesting too about their imprisonment is that unfortunately none of the details of the case survive. Now that's common in Irish criminal history because many of the legal records were destroyed in the forecourts during the Civil War. But unfortunately I've been unable to find any newspaper account of the case either. But what I did find was that a petition called a memorial at the time was written to the Chief Secretary in order that these guys could be released earlier. Well, presumably, yeah, it would have been about that. Now, the petition doesn't survive either, even though it's, without going into a whole archival history, it was extant, I think, when the forecourts were destroyed, but disappeared at some point subsequently, which isn't entirely uncommon either in the kind of experience that I've had. And I've written a couple of texts on penal history in the 19th century, and these records being missing, isn't entirely unusual. You couldn't say it's unusual at all, really. But unfortunately, the memorial doesn't survive. But what the memorial does, the reason we know it exists is because it was entered on a correspondence register in the Chief Secretary's office. He did receive the memorial. And these memorials, again, in my experience of looking at them, they were usually written by Protestant gentlemen, Protestant landowners of the community. So it tells me that the Collins family were regarded highly enough and well in enough with one of the local Protestant gentry that he wrote this memorial on their behalf. And those two men were released, I think, 3 months before their sentence expired. Again, that wouldn't have been terribly unusual. But the memorial being written was certainly interesting in terms of the relationship, as I say, that it indicates. The kind of family story then was that Michael's father, Michael John, used to travel back and forth to Cork City every week in his horse and car to see his brothers in prison. So and that it left it had an effect on him, that he was recounted those stories later. As I say, all of it, is very likely true, given that the official record backs up the Collins family story in as much as it possibly can. So those are two kind of reasons why there was kind of rebel activity within the family. But we must remember that all of that was, decades before Michael Collins was born. The Fenian Rebellion was 1867. The Michael Collins who was arrested at that time. The imprisonment I'm talking about were the 1850s. Michael Collins wasn't born until 1890. So, at least, 25 years after all of this, or almost 25 years after all of this. Collins' father in his youth, insofar as we can tell, was actually quite a moderate man, and we can tell that primarily from Mary Collins Powell's memoir. She was one of Collins's sisters who later wrote an account of her youth, and she recounts her father being quite a moderate man, reading the Weekly Freeman, which was a nationalist newspaper. Another of the sisters recounts a story of how his father, or how her father, got beaten up by a member of his own extended family for lending a winnowing machine to a local Protestant rector. Now, why would such a thing have happened? Well, again, I was curious, so I went looking, and I found that about 6 months before Michael Collins was born, there was a row with a local Protestant rector in nearby Castleventry. He took over the management of a farm from a local family who'd been evicted from the farm, and there were 2 attempts to evict that family, and there was violence certainly at the first one, and the kind of boycott of that rector continued for some time afterwards. So I would suggest if you lent him a winnowing machine, you would have a problem, and it appears, that Michael Collins' father did have a problem. Now, the lady in question who wrote her memory of that, she was Mercy Nunn in England, Collins' sister. She also mentioned that the winnowing machine was subsequently cemented into the floor, so it couldn't be lent to anybody again. So it's an interesting story, and again, it does have some validity, perhaps, in that there was a dispute. When she mentioned this, she didn't mention the dispute, but the fact that we know that this dispute happened, I think, gives her story considerable credibility. But what it tells me about Michael Collins' father is that he was, by that time, quite a moderate man. So, in other words, he was willing to swim against the tide of what was locally popular political opinion, and he was willing to do what he felt was the right thing by lending the winnowing machine to this man. So why did he feel it was the right thing? Well, according to his daughter, the lady in question, she had been badly burned as a child, and the rector had actually lent medical assistance to the family at that time. And Collins' father felt that he basically owed the man for doing that, and so that's why he lent him the winnowing machine. So, as I say, a man who was willing to swim against the tide of what was the local, probably gang mentality at the time, and he was willing to do it when he felt it was the right thing to do. It also dictates, as I say, that his nationalist sentiments, his anti-landlord sentiments, his political views had maybe moderated somewhat by that time. So that's the father and the kind of rebel aspect of the family. Now, and as I say, the biographies will tell you the basic story, that the rebel aspect is there. When you look at the official records, the basic story, I think, is really propped up by the official records. I think the family stories are actually far more accurate than I would have expected them to be. I was inclined maybe initially to dismiss them as just kind of lore, but I think they're far more than that. There is considerable credibility to the family stories of rebel activity in the family. Now, what none of the biographies will tell you, though, is the more interesting, or the politics that Collins grew up in the shadow of. They tell you that he mixed with a local blacksmith called Santry. He used to call to the forge on the way home in the evenings, and he was taught by Dennis Lyons in the school in Lisvard. Both Lyons and Santry were militant Republicans with backgrounds in that area. Now, another one of the daughters tells us in her memoir of the time that her mother she says something like, Michael was the top of his class, and her mother was, quote, she said something like, her mother was anxious to remove him from mischief, okay? Now, what does she mean by that? We can't really say. It's just left hanging there. It's the Collins Powell memoir again. My guess would be that perhaps the woman I described, who had siblings in public employment at the time, crown employment, if you want to call it that, had a value in all of that Collins had several siblings who were teachers and civil servants too. She may have wished to remove him from the influence of these local Republicans. So she sent him into Clan, for whatever reason anyway, she sent him into Clonakilty to do to do a preparatory course for the civil service exams. Now the civil service exams were a kind of a common way for people out of country areas in Ireland at the time. The formal education for them didn't really exist, so what appears to have happened is that Collins was enrolled in kind of night classes or extracurricular classes in the school in Clonakilty, where he learned the skills that were necessary to do his civil service exams. Now, while he was in Clonakilty, he lived with his brother-in-law, a guy called Patrick O'Driscoll, and his sister, Margaret O'Driscoll. Both of them are interesting people in their own right. Patrick O'Driscoll had started off life working in Deasty's Brewery in Clonakilty, but had an interest in both journalism and politics, and he approached the local Monsignor in Clonakilty, who was on the board of the Southern Star newspaper in Skibbereen, and he asked him could he take a job in the Southern Star. Now, what was agreed at that point was that O'Driscoll would take a job reporting on local issues in Clonakilty for the Southern Star, and the question of remuneration later became an issue, shall we say. It's difficult to decipher what exactly was agreed as regards remuneration. The Monsignor later said one thing and Patrick O'Driscoll said another. Now, Driscoll was an extremely talented writer, extremely politically active, and he made his way up the ranks of the Southern Star, and within 2 years of joining it, he became the editor of the newspaper. So a very, very talented guy. Now, around that time as well, he met Margaret Collins, and she was the principal of the girls' school in Lisavard at that stage, and she'd already received the Blake Premium, which I think was a prestigious award for her educational activity in Lisavard. Now, the two of them were married, and just a few months after their marriage, Driscoll announced his intention to the Southern Star that he would leave that publication and would be starting a newspaper of his own. Well, he didn't announce he'd be starting a newspaper of his own, but he subsequently did. Now, after Driscoll left the Southern Star, there was a whole dispute between him and the Southern Star as to how much money he was owed by the newspaper and whether or not he should have taken money that he took from the newspaper, which he felt was owed to him. Okay, that dispute ended up in court, and it was a particularly, messy and bitter legal engagement that the Southern Star and Patrick O'Driscoll engaged in. Now, O'Driscoll went away and he founded the Cork Sun newspaper. The Cork Sun was a highly political newspaper, very much in favour of William O'Brien. Now, and that's where maybe we should talk a little bit about William O'Brien, because it's the part of Collins' youth that is probably most neglected. William O'Brien led a part of what was known as the Irish Parliamentary Party at the time, which was really just a collection of independents who tended to vote the same way in the Westminster Parliament. Redmond and Dillon kind of led this mainstream faction. William O'Brien led this other faction. They weren't always in dispute or at odds with each other, but they sometimes were. William O'Brien was particularly interested in land issues and in home rule as well, but I think land probably animated him that little bit more. William O'Brien was extremely popular in the Cork area. His party or his political movements were very, very strong there. And Patrick O'Driscoll, Michael Collins' brother-in-law, was a big fan of William O'Brien, and his newspaper, the Cork Sun, reflected that. Now, speaking about that newspaper, it was heavily bankrolled by the Collins family. In other words, they put up most of the share capital for this, them and the O'Driscoll family. So O'Driscoll then controlled most of the share capital of the newspaper through his family members. But for all of that, he couldn't get put on the board of the enterprise. The other shareholders wouldn't have him because of this murky past and this row that he'd had with the Southern Star. So although he controlled most of the share capital, he couldn't get put on the board of the newspaper. Now he and the Collins and Driscoll families tried to get him put on the board on several occasions and failed on several occasions. Their last failure came in 1903, I think it was 1903, and it was 1905 actually. The family, they called an extraordinary general meeting in Cork City. The shareholders met on the Grand Parade in Cork, and they tried to put Driscoll on the board again. Harsh words were exchanged. The whole thing broke up in a punch-up. The cops were called to break up the punch-up. There was even a gun produced at the meeting, according to one account. Okay. Now, if you look at the list of people who called that meeting, it was Collins's mother, Collins's brother, Collins's sisters, Collins's in-laws. So very much, a Collins family meeting, if you like. Now, Collins himself is not listed among the attendees at the meeting. Or among those who called it, but he was only 15 years of age, and if Michael Collins wasn't at that meeting, he was the only Collins that wasn't at that meeting. He lived with Patrick O'Driscoll while all of this went on, so I strongly suspect that he was at that meeting, and given the kind of intense violence that took place there, that may well have been his introduction to violence. Okay. Now, the other major O'Brienite that Collins grew up around was his brother Johnny. And again, it's never mentioned in any of the biographies. Johnny largely didn't speak about his own political career in the later years of his life, and that's probably why it's never mentioned by any of the biographers. But Johnny had run for local office with William O'Brien's faction in 1902, I think it was. He failed to get the seat, and he blamed the other faction of the Irish Parliamentary Party for that failure, the more mainstream faction, if you like. He was extremely bitter about that, and he wrote a very hostile letter to the newspaper about it all. So Johnny Collins was certainly not a fan of the Redmondite wing of the Parliamentary Party, and Michael Collins was 12 years old when all of that happened, and he lived with his brother Johnny during that bitter campaign. So the O'Brienite influence on Michael Collins, I think, is extremely important to remember and extremely important to consider when we're speaking about his youth. So Collins, lived with O'Driscoll and lived around these kind of O'Brienites in his teenage years, really. Though he may have been influenced by Republicans like he probably was influenced by Republicans like Santry and Lyons in his earlier years. The family certainly said he was, and as I say, much of what the family said seems to have been accurate. So they were probably focused on his republicanism because that's what he was known for, and they somewhat neglected the O'Brienite dimension of Collins's political career or political moulding, I suppose, and that O'Brienite part of it came, just before he left Ireland and headed off to England. So he was already, if you like, swimming against the tide of mainstream nationalism by the time he went to England. Now, the last thing to mention is, how did he end up in England? Well, he did his civil service exams. He was 15 when he did them, I think, in Cork City, in what is now University College Cork. So how well did he do in those exams? Collins, if you put him next to his peers who did that exam in Cork City, he came in the top, I think, 22%. So he was, up there. He was, he did well in his exams. Now, if you put him amongst all the many thousands who had done those exams across the British Isles at the time, he's in the top 40%. So still in the upper half of the class, if you like, and amongst his peers who had similar education, he's even in the upper quarter of the class. So his achievement is, I think, quite impressive. An extremely intelligent guy, and particularly intelligent, I think, when you take into account the fact that he did those exams when he was 15. Most of those doing the exams would have been 16 or 17. would have been that bit better educated, and certainly those doing them in England, Scotland and Wales would seem to have had an edge on their Irish counterparts in terms of education at the time, or formal education anyway at the time. So he did, I think, well in his exams. Now, another reason that you can say he did particularly well in them perhaps is a recent account of one of his sisters, which we just found recently. Biographers have always known about the account of Mary Collins Powell and Sister Celestine, his sister in England, Helena. But there is an account from one of his other sisters as well of the youth of their youth in Woodfield, and she mentioned that around the time that Collins was departing for London, or that he was doing his exams, that her mother had a financial setback. Okay, so she says that Collins did very well in those exams. She's probably hemming it up a little bit. She is his sister, she was fond of him, but she says that it was intended that he would remain at school and study for a higher grade, except that her mother had some financial difficulties, and it was decided that he should take the job in England at the lower grade so as he could begin to provide for himself. Now, what it tells me is that the guy probably did those exams possibly initially as a practice run, if you like, but that certainly he wasn't ready to do those exams, and it was intended that he would move on and do another set of exams about a year later. So it tells you that the exams he did, he wasn't fully prepared for, and he still managed to do extremely well. So that's kind of a little bit about the youth of Michael Collins and how he was moulded, I guess, before he took off for London and met these advanced militant Republicans like Sam Maguire over there. I guess in conclusion you could say that he was a guy who had certainly a knowledge of militant Republicanism in his background. And we should mention as well, I forgot to mention, the Woodfield Farm, which is in about 7 different plots out in the townland. It's a very dispersed, scattered farm. It's or was a very dispersed and scattered farm. An unusual holding, I think, in that regard, and it's probably like that because the family, like most Irish farming families, picked up land as a result of the tragedy that befell other families during the famine. And when Collins walked his farm with his father and had to walk, through a neighbour's field to get to another one of their fields, he had to have asked how that happened. His father had lived through the famine. So Collins, in conclusion, I guess you could say, was a guy who was aware of the republicanism that had been in Ireland in the past. Indeed, we should have said as well that while he lived in Clonakilty, there were fundraising efforts and the eventual erection of a statue in the middle of the town to the local United Irishmen who had fought in the Battle of the Big Cross near Shannon Vale. And he lived with Patrick O'Driscoll, who seems to have been the secretary of the group who raised the funding to put that statue down the town, and that involved kind of torchlit processions when Donovan Rossa visited the town. Collins was a teenager living in Clon at that point, so again that's another, if he wasn't already aware of the Republican militantism in his own family, he was certainly aware of the broader Republican militantism that was in Irish society. So he went off to England then with this kind of, he was, from the experiences of his own youth and the O'Brienite support within his own family, he was already swimming against the tide of mainstream nationalism, and he had this republicanism in his family going back many decades, and had seen that republicanism emerge again in Clonakilty during his teenage years. So I guess he was, perhaps you could say, ripe for the plucking to a degree. And when he went away to England, he met guys like Sam Maguire and others over there. And that's, I guess, where the militant republicanism of Michael Collins was forged. So that would conclude our talk on Michael Collins and his youth. And hopefully we've provided you with something new. And as I say, most of it is outlined in an essay which is on our website, and the Patrick O'Driscoll stuff is outlined in an essay which was published in the Clonakilty Journal of last year, 2021. So thanks for listening. Goodbye.
So there we have it, a fantastic presentation by Cal McCarthy that really gives us a much better understanding of Michael Collins, where he came from, and I suppose what influenced him in his early years as well. It confirms an awful lot of what we had already believed about Collins, but it gives evidence for that as well as a few interesting new findings there as well. So thank you for listening to the Michael Collins House podcast, and join us again the next time very soon. Thank you. Goodbye.